Hey folks, I had a content idea I wanted to talk about with you here, something that's come up a few times recently and I think maybe it merits having a more detailed conversation on. So I'm just shooting a quick video here on this now, and if you like it, I can do a full, more in-depth discussion on the main podcast with maybe some of the Fighting Matters crew. This is Steve, by the way, from BJJ Mental Models and Fighting Matters. I want to talk about keeping politics out of Jiu-Jitsu. This is something I have heard a lot of people say, that we should keep politics out of Jiu-Jitsu. I recently sent out a newsletter on BJJ Mental Models talking about quality decision-making. And one of the topics that we discussed was vaccination, something that is overwhelmingly supported by the data. And if you strip your emotion out of the conversation and look rationally at whether or not you and yours should get vaccinated, the answer is a strong and unequivocal yes. But as expected, I was told to keep politics out of jiu-jitsu. And today here, what I want to talk about is why that is wrong. And in fact, we should do the opposite. We should focus on bringing politics into jiu-jitsu. And first, I think we maybe need to take a step back and explain what we even mean by politics. So what I've observed is when people say things like keep politics out of jiu-jitsu, normally what they mean is keep out discussions of things that I personally don't like. But for things that I support, those are okay. And we can define those in such a way that they're not considered politics. But for the things that I don't like, those are politics. Vaccination is a great example, right? People, if you are told to get vaccinated by a jiu-jitsu personality, there's going to be a lot of pushback saying, hey, you should keep this out of jiu-jitsu. You know, I followed you for jiu-jitsu stuff. I'm going to unsubscribe. And that's your right to do so if you feel that that is the best way to focus your attention. But I think it's wrong to say that we should keep these things out of jiu-jitsu. First of all, let's talk about vaccination. There's nothing inherently political about vaccination, or at least there shouldn't be. The science is the science, and it says what it says. Now, of course, politics touch on vaccines, and we'll elaborate on that a bit in a second. But there is a reason why scientific research is generally best done independently without the influence of politics. It is impossible in the world today to do anything without the influence of politics, but to the best extent that we can for some things like medicine and science and economics, there's a reason why we try to separate those out and keep them as independent from political concerns as possible. Now, that said, though, people will sometimes take topics that they don't like vaccination or trans participation in sports, and they will try to cloak these as being a political thing. I would say two things to that. First of all, people who take that approach, they have defined vaccination and trans participation in sports as being political. That was their decision, not the decision of the rest of us who support this stuff. I think most of us would prefer that these topics be handled objectively and in a data-driven fashion. But some people have chosen to make those political. I would venture to guess, though, that if you were to ask those same people, hey, what do you feel about training law enforcement on jiu-jitsu? Or what do you feel about bringing jiu-jitsu into school programs to teach anti-bullying? I would guess that those same people would probably be all in favor of those things, even though they are extremely political. And I'm not saying we shouldn't do those things. I'm just pointing out the hypocrisy in saying that, well, vaccines are political, but Leo jiu-jitsu training is not. They're both very political things, and it all just comes down to where you draw the line. And are you drawing that line in a self-serving way to help promote your arguments and your points while suppressing discussion about the others? I mean, beyond that, on the topic of vaccines, look, athlete safety should always be one of the first and foremost concerns when we're talking about training jiu-jitsu. If we care about preventing the spread of things like staph, and if we care about disinfecting the mats, we should also be willing to talk about vaccination. I'm not saying that every jiu-jitsu practitioner or gym owner needs to be a vaccine activist, but it should be considered okay to talk about those, because ultimately germs and viruses, they don't have political leanings, regardless of whether people may assume they do or not. Beyond that, though, I want to expand this discussion and just point out that ultimately everything is political. Saying that you should keep politics out of something is bad faith, because ultimately everything does have a degree of politics in and around it. Now, as I said earlier, to the best extent possible, we often want to draw dividing lines between our politics and other things like medicine, simply because it allows for better decision making. But we would be naive to say that politics doesn't touch these things at all, right? I mean, at the end of the day, if government policy is involved, politics are involved. And jiu-jitsu people will often tell me, well, I don't get involved in this stuff because I'm not political. And again, I would point out that yes, you are. You just maybe have ceded your ability to speak or ceded your voice on some very important matters, probably because you're afraid of blowback. But everything that we do is political, right? If you are watching this video on a social media platform, that is to some extent a political decision, because these social media companies are very closely affiliated with the government, lobbying with the government. Your decision to support platforms that distribute content like ours is, to some degree, a political statement, right? Beyond that, the device that you're watching this on, right? I mean, I could nitpick human rights violations involved in making devices overseas and offshoring this kind of technology. I could talk about how much harm big tech companies have done to society and how political that is. And all of us are making a tacit political endorsement by participating in the system. And again, this is not to be judgy, right? I mean, none of us are completely perfect. The world today is so interconnected that it's impossible to not touch politics at all. I'm not saying that we should be all judgy of people because of their choice of device or where they get their content from, but I am merely saying that we need to be honest and admit that politics touch everything. And so when you tell people, don't bring politics into jiu-jitsu, to some extent, you're being disingenuous. Maybe you have this ideal of what jiu-jitsu is like and how it's non-political, but that is often a self-serving personal bias that you've created. I mean, if you drive on public roads to get to your jiu-jitsu gym, which is to some extent powered by public utilities, and if the land was developed on anything resembling a public grant, your jiu-jitsu was already political, whether you want it to be or not. Politics touches everything, and in a sport where we always talk about how we train this so that we can learn to get comfortable in uncomfortable situations and lean into difficult things, in that kind of environment, it seems silly to then say, well, we don't talk about politics because that has no place here. Politics has a place everywhere. And if you're a real martial artist, your number one goal, first and foremost, should be using this culture that we've created for the betterment of society. And sometimes that's going to mean, teaching people how to get in shape. Sometimes that's going to mean using the small platforms that we all have to stand up for what's right. So look, you don't have to agree with me on vaccination or political beliefs. I don't expect everyone to agree with everything I say, but don't tell me to shut up about it, right? And don't tell other people to shut up about it when they are in good faith reaching out and trying to share scientific evidence. There are a lot of people who put a lot of, virtuous messaging in their social media profiles about how spiritual and wholesome they are as a person. But then as soon as they see something that they don't like, they will launch into a level of vitriol and personal attack that would get most people suspended from high school, right? And these are grown-ups we're talking about. They should know better. So all of that is to say that this whole keep politics out of jiu-jitsu thing, it is a myth. It is a farce. It has never existed. Politics are a part of life, whether you like it or not. You can't be an ostrich and put your head in the sand and ignore it, especially when so much is at stake today, right? I mean, between the political situation, between the rise of the anti-vax movement, these are things that covering your head up and just saying they don't affect me, you're going to be very disappointed to discover how much these things do actually impact you, and you're going to regret not having spoken up when you had the chance to do so, when you could have done something about it. So my request is, first of all, don't be afraid to use your voice. Don't be afraid to get political, even if other people suggest that you don't do that. And beyond that, don't tell people that they should stop doing this, right? If someone is showing the courage to speak out and share their beliefs, that is a lot more important than any technique you'll learn on the mats. So there you go.